Hello, everyone. We're going to talk about whether and how computational design is considered a medium and what that means to be considered a medium. So, if we think about what is a medium, it's not really clear. It's not really a part of English spoken vocabulary that we would break down. So we would tend to think about medium as the size of your trousers or your t-shirt rather than anything else. But we talk about the media a lot, and they're kind of the same thing. So if we look at the definition, um, we can use medium in a few ways, and you can describe something as an adjective of medium, which is what size it is. But the more important one for us is the fact that it's the intervening substance through which sensory impressions are conveyed or physical forces are transmitted, which is a bit of a weird idea, but it means that if you're going to write a story, the medium is going to be either the kind of paper or the pen, or maybe even just the concept of writing in general. So kind of broad term. And the plural is media. So if I have some drawings and some writing, then I have two media. That's basically the kind of framework for it. And so we could have paintings like this one in the media would be paint or watercolor paint and a particular kind of paper, or we could have a pencil sketch, or we could have pyrography. And something to bear in mind is that different types of media, different mediums, plural, um, produce different kinds of images, not just the same picture, but looking a bit different, but actually completely different forms of uh, art, if you want to put it that way. And the most famous quote that comes from About Media is this Marshall McLuhan quote, which the medium is the message, is the thing that comes up over and over again. And so, what do we mean by that? And he's saying this quite complicated thing, which I'll read out, but we'll try and explain it in a little bit more detail in a second. This is merely to say that the personal and social consequences of any medium, that is, of any extension of ourselves, and what he's saying here is that any medium is just a way of extending our being, result from the new scale that is introduced into our affairs by each extension of ourselves or by any new technology. And so he's talking about this idea that anything that allows you to extend yourself in further into the world is a medium, which is an interesting way to look at it. But the way that it's usually interpreted is the idea that when you're making communication of some sort, the medium is carrying the message and it's also being the message. So the one I quite like thinking about is that "You're next" painted in blood on the wall of your house has a very different meaning to "You're next" by someone in a shop when they're telling you who's going to be next. So same message. The medium is the thing that changes the meaning. So is computational design a medium? What does that even mean? So this is the um, 2019 Acadia Quadria conference in in Wellington, New Zealand. So there's Mark Orell, there's Tiara, and she used to be on this course. And there's a bunch of other people in here that have something to say about whether this is a medium or not. I'm in here somewhere, I think, if you can find me. Um, and this is a community of practice. The people who do computational design will often attend this conference and they're seeking mastery of this medium. So they would kind of argue that it is a medium. Um, and we've talked about idea pumps before, and we're going to talk about them over and over again as we go through the whole degree. And this idea is that we can use analysis and simulation as one of our mediums. So this is the reading of Up and Down the Ladder of Abstraction by Brett Victor. And he goes into quite a lot of detail here about just this little car that can jiggle around on a road. And he builds these diagrams that help you think. So we saw him doing exactly the same thing in his video that we watched in class, where he's trying to show the time angle of a system independently of the spatial angle. That is simulating a car driving around. This is a space syntax visibility analysis that's simulating how much any given space is visible from all the other spaces. And this is often called visual integration. And so you can see spaces that can see many other spaces go red, and spaces that can see only very few spaces are blue. And you can imagine inside a circle can see everywhere else inside a circle. That's a convex shape. And if you're on the inside of a convex shape, you can see the shape, you can see everywhere else. And these kinds of analyses are used for all sorts of things. People use them usefully or less usefully, but they've been very well used in schools to avoid bullying. People can't really beat you up and steal your lunch money in a place where they're well overseen. And so this would be a good space to steal someone's lunch money. This would be a much less good space. This as well. And so what we can kind of imagine from this is that we can use these tools to help us think in new ways. The other way that you could think about this is to take a system in the world that you know exists and try and uncover its hidden rules. So this is some very early work that's covered in Paul Coates' book that was one of the readings for week 1, where he's trying to establish whether they can work out urban planning or urban planning rules from pre-planning civilizations by trying to work out simple computational rules. And they did. They managed to find out how to structure these rules quite simply to produce outcomes that are sort of believable. And that leads us to a kind of world that works like this. This is NetLogo, and I'm going to demo a NetLogo model to sort of understand what's going on. So this is the Schelling segregation model. This is from 1978 that he did this work, very early in the computer world. So at this point, there's a pretty good chance that he did the original work on this just on a piece of graph paper, drawing dots and things. And so this is a little interactive tool that people can build very easily. So you set it up, and we have blue people and orange people. These stand in for cultures or races or whatever you want to think about. And the idea that he was trying to understand here is how come we end up with racially segregated sort of ghettos in cities whenever you talk to people in those areas, they don't come across as particularly racist. And so if we say we just randomly populate this with some people, we've got a density of 95%, so there's only 5% white squares. And these people are happy as long as 19% of their neighborhood is like them. And so when we think about a neighborhood, we've got this person's neighborhood is the squares immediately adjacent to them. So if we press go on this and watch it settle, it comes to a conclusion very quickly. And we can kind of see these people are largely with people who are a bit like them. And so fine, that kind of makes sense. But as we push these numbers up, let's go to 55 with this, and we press setup again, we see the same original thing, except we see a lot more little crosses. So crosses are unhappy people, squares are happy people. And if we go with this, it should take a little bit longer to settle down. But what we see is very quickly, we're getting these sort of shapes that show strong boundaries. And if you decrease the density a little bit, sometimes you'll get quite strong moats around these shapes. Now this one's settled, which is good, well, good for our purposes. But what does it tell us about society? That's what's really interesting here, is it's saying that actually you can get quite segregated spaces with quite low levels of desire for people like you. It would seem odd that you would want to live in a neighborhood where nobody is like you, nobody understands you, nobody sells the food that you want to buy. So even with relatively low amounts of segregation desire, you would end up with segregation a little bit like this. The other thing you might notice is what the boundaries of any given situation are. So even if we go to something like 80 and we set it up again and we press go, this is very unlikely to ever settle because people are very unhappy at all times. Particularly with a city that's this dense, we're not going to get to any kind of conclusion. So this is just going to keep running forever. Now, what's really interesting here is this percent similar wanted. If we drop the density to very low, let's say something like 40, let's turn it off first, and then we set it up, and then we go, we should see this starting to converge much more quickly. Maybe not. Maybe we need to drop it a bit further. Let's drop it to 40. Like I was planning to. There we go. Set that up. Okay. 50 is the lowest we can go. So if we set this up now, we can start to see these regions forming of sort of happy-ish people. We can kind of think maybe this shows us something about why rural communities end up one way and urban communities end up another way. Now, what does this tell us? It's an interesting question. So George Box has this, he's a statistician, he has this quote, I'm saying just like George Box, he has this quote, all models are wrong, but some are useful. And so what do we think is wrong with that previous model, the Schelling model there? There's a guy called Pareto who says that, Wilfred Pareto, he says that 80% of the work is done by 20% of the people. That's one of the interpretations of his work. And so maybe 80% of the work is being done by 20% of the power of the model. Adding a little bit more to it might not get us much. So things like maybe people care about more than just racial makeup of a neighborhood. People don't just move around randomly, and there's no geography or economics in that model. However, it still does something useful. It's telling us something about the world and giving us a kind of intuition pump that pushes us towards a better and deeper understanding of the world. Now, maybe by adding more detail to it, we would get some kind of phase change and we would get a very interesting outcome. But at the moment, that's a pretty good thing. Those models really last. So let's have a look at these buildings. The left is 550 Madison Avenue, built in 1984 for AT&T, and the right one is the Equitable Tower, built in 1985. They both look sort of similar shapes, similar. They're kind of products of the technology of their time. So, what does this mean? We shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. Or the more commonly known, but a bit more recent, I think this is a riff on that. We shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us. So if we think about we're making tools and then our tools are making us, these buildings, these two buildings, are very much a feature of the tooling of the time. Some kind of product of tooling, technology, all that sort of stuff. And you can see these shapes, they're very straightforward circles and triangles and rectangles, just extruded off the page. And that's because they're either coming from very early CAD programs or from hand drawing. And these sorts of very complex shapes are very difficult to do by hand. And so this is a kind of slightly terrible Photoshop drawing, but you see this showing up in beginner designers' work all the time, where the tool has an outsized command over the kind of outcomes that you end up with. So in this case, there's the Photoshop filters. So people will often come up with some kind of filtery type thing in Photoshop, and they'll be like, oh, I'll apply it to my model, and I'll drag it right the way over to the edge, and you end up with a picture that looks like it was a Photoshop filter. So that's the tool. The medium is driving the design rather than the designer. So this is a good example of this. This is the Asymptote Architecture New York Stock Exchange virtual trading floor from 1997, 99-ish. And it's very much a product of the software, but also of the mindset. So people were playing with animation tools like 3D Studio and Maya at the time, but they weren't really thinking too much about why they were doing something. This looks very similar to the New York Stock Exchange as it really is. In fact, I think there was a Balenciaga fashion show in it about 6 months ago, and it looked just like this. Why were people recreating a physical space in the virtual realm? It's just because people hadn't really matured as tool users or as medium users. So this is an interesting idea. There's another one. This was the Essing showroom, or the cockpit, as the architect called it, and that was done by Cas Osterhaus in the Netherlands. But that was done in 2003, built in 2005. The interesting thing about this was that it was designed to be seen from a motorway. So doing the European motorway speed of 130 kilometers driving past this thing, what did it mean to see this very long, skinny building from an angle and going very fast? And animation software made it possible to appreciate that. And that gave Cas this new way of thinking about how the shape should show up. And this is some stuff in Rhino. You just subdivide a box enough times and you end up with a pebble. It's kind of the way pebbles are made. You're just knocking the corners off and knocking the corners off. And that led to a very kind of aesthetic, a very obvious aesthetic over time. And this was your kind of Eisenman blob detector type stuff. But the big problem was that people started building the diagram. So they would draw a diagram or they would use their tool or whatever, and people would kind of end up with a building that looked like the tooling rather than the building that looked the right way that it was intended to. And so this intuition pump idea, by the way, it was coined by Daniel Dennett, who is called one of the four horsemen of consciousness. He and a few other people are really big on this consciousness debate, but we'll keep coming back to the idea of the intuition pump over and over again. So how are we going to pump our intuition? And one of the big ways is by discussing things with people, by communicating. And so everything is communication, realistically. You're either having a conversation with someone else or even with yourself. Remember in cybernetics, we were talking about a conversation with your notebook. And so if we've got a communication system like this one, which it's just some Teams or some Zoom or something along those lines, you're having a communication with another person or a group of people. You're trying to build consensus or you're trying to understand something. And so are these people. These are people doing architectural drawing or technical drawing. I'm not sure what they're drawing a long time ago. And so they're trying to communicate something to another group of people. And that has kind of led to this architecture or construction idea of building information modeling, or BIM. People talk about this an awful lot. And that is providing some interesting questions around medium, because most people still treat it as a drawing tool rather than as a simulation tool. So I'm sure we're going to get into that at a later date, maybe even somewhere else in the course. But let's have a look at some examples of some buildings here. This is the Birmingham Selfridges. It's by Future Systems, and it's a kind of unconstrained blobbiness. You can kind of see that by the fact that it just has these little dots all over it that are not particularly evenly spaced, and they're just there to hide whatever's going on underneath. That was fine. There's no judgment against it. It's just a kind of loose appreciation of what you can do with tools. Then we get into slightly more constrained and careful use of tools. And this is the Kessa Futura from St. Moritz by Foster and Partners. And they used a tool called DDD, which was dimension-driven design. And what that meant was that they had a 2D slice through that building. They slid around the building, and that shape there was dictated by the relationship with the rail that runs around the bottom of it. This one had a totally different medium constraining its shape. Frank Gehry works with, this is the Guggenheim in Bilbao by Frank Gehry. He works with this very stiff paper that can't stretch. So he knows that every one of his shapes can be rolled out into a flat shape if you can cut it enough. So a little bit like the way fashion designers work. And then this is again Foster and Partners. It's a later building. It's the Sage in Gateshead, and this is maybe a less exciting looking building, but it's a very constrained, very controlled building. Each one of these rectangular panels is flat, and that search for flat quadrilaterals is a very important part in making a building cheap enough to build. And so by using a well understood, well controlled medium, they were able to build something or design something that was cheap enough to really build. Because if we go back to this one, and to some extent this one, and definitely this one, money was kind of being thrown at the problem rather than something that had to be built for a kind of realistic budget. And so that takes us to my first real project. These are the Dubai metro stations. And these are, again, very constrained, flat, rectangular panels, or almost rectangular panels. See how they get thinner at that end and fatter in the middle. That constraint meant that we could build a whole bunch of metro stations using the same kind of pattern in a way that worked out for what was needed of it. This is a section of a torus, so a donut shape chopped out. And I think this one is a series of little chunks of cones all glued together. So that takes us on to something like this. This is a Zaha painting. And when I was saying don't build the diagram, Zaha Hadid's office, Zaha Hadid Associates, are very guilty of that. So they end up designing things like this, which have very little substance in them because they look good but haven't been thought through. So this is a great painting. I love these paintings, and they're able to evoke you to do something very interesting. However, if you end up building the painting quite directly, you're building the diagram, you end up with these systems that don't really take into account the human nature of who's going to occupy them. They just look really good on a investor deck. So we get into this next stage of the world, I guess, when we have a metaverse and people are trying to work out what metaverse architecture is and what it means to be in the metaverse. And if we read books like Snow Crash or Ready Player One, we can kind of understand that the metaverse doesn't have the same constraints as the universe. There's no physics, there's no spatial constraints of going from A to B. And so we really don't know what will happen in that area, that medium, and it's undefined. So that really leaves that bit up to you. So you're now coming into a maturing field. This idea of computational design really is, even if you go as old as you possibly could, it's only as old as computing. And so maximum 80 years. And there's really no other major field that's that young. Music is much older, and so on. And so you get to decide a bunch of things about how it's going to work. You get to make some shapes, make some forms, but you can also do research with computational design. And the design process is very long. The research of understanding what the problem is versus the problem solving of creating a solution which has maybe a shape or a system or something along those lines. So you can use computers to appreciate what the problem is, to find out what the world is really like. And you can then use simulation to test whether you think that your version of the world is correct. And so there's all kinds of different angles you can take on it. And as a kind of cautionary tale, you're at university now, so you've got 3 years to do as much ridiculous stuff as you want. And for the rest of your career, you're going to have to be a bit sensible, potentially. So you get to be as radical as you want for the next 3 years and get that out of your system now, because the more radical you are now, the more mistakes you make now, the more you're going to understand the world so that you can do good work when you're out there in the world. Whereas if you're conservative now, you'll be constrained by that conservatism for the rest of your life. So that's about it for a medium. We've got I'm going to be on a plane right now, I believe. So if you have any questions, stick them into Teams underneath this recording, and I'll answer them when I touch down, and we can have some kind of interesting discussion there. And I'll leave you with Farnaz.